My name is Ciaran O'Faircheallaigh. I'm Professor of Politics and Public Policy at Griffith University in Brisbane in Australia. I have been interested in mining and multinational mining companies and the impact that they have for many years, since early on in my career. Initially, my study was focused on relations between multinational mining companies and national governments. I looked at, in my PhD, foreign investment in a number of different countries, including Zambia in Central Africa, Papua New Guinea, and Ireland, which is where I'm from originally, and Australia. I was interested in the way in which multinational companies operate. I was interested in the impact they have on economies, but also on communities and on people. In the late 1980s, I got a job at a research unit in Darwin in Australia's Northern Territory. And there, for the first time, I started working with Aboriginal people. They were very much affected by mining companies, many of them the same multinational mining companies that I'd looked at in my PhD. And I started working with them, helping them to deal with companies that wanted to operate on their traditional lands. My knowledge of multinational mining companies and how they work was very valuable for Aboriginal people, because often Aboriginal people in Australia, but Indigenous people globally, do not know a lot about the companies that come and want to work on their traditional lands. There's a very common saying that knowledge is power. If you want to be able to deal effectively with anybody who wants to come and work on your traditional lands, you need to be able to understand them. And that's how my knowledge of multinational companies was useful to communities. At first, I provided advice primarily on financial issues because I understood the economics of multinational mining companies. I understood how they operate, how they organize their affairs. But as I got more involved with Aboriginal people, I started working in other areas as well, particularly on helping them to carry out community consultations, to undertake their own impact assessments in terms of figuring out what the impact of these companies would be, and using that information to support them in negotiating with companies. Let me begin with some historical perspective. Up until the 1970s, the early 1980s, Aboriginal people had very little capacity to influence what happened on their traditional lands. Usually, they were simply pushed aside. Let me give you a concrete example. In 1979, a company which was a subsidiary of Rio Tinto discovered diamond mines in Western Australia at a place called Argyle. At exactly that same place, there was a very important Aboriginal women's sacred site. This site was registered with the West Australian government as a sacred site and should have been protected. But under legislation at that time, a company could go to the relevant government minister and get permission to destroy a site. The Aboriginal people in this case fought every way they knew how. They went to court. They tried to stop the project, but they weren't able to. That mine went ahead and it completely destroyed that very important women's site. It literally took away a mountain on which that site was located. So that's a concrete example of the way things were. Things began to change at about that time because of the push for recognition of Aboriginal rights in general, but in particular, the push for recognition of Aboriginal rights in land. That began in Australia's Northern Territory because it was under federal jurisdiction. It was easier to achieve change in federal jurisdiction because state governments in Australia are very pro-mining. That first piece of legislation gave Aboriginal people an opportunity to claim their traditional lands. And if they were successful, it gave them a veto over development. This was a big change because now companies had to come and seek the permission of Aboriginal people to mine. And of course, Aboriginal people were not going to give them permission if it involved destruction of important sites or damage to sites. But It was slower to bring about change in the States and Australia. And eventually it was only because the Australian High Court intervened and made a very important decision in 1992 called the Mabo decision that things began to change in favour of Aboriginal people. The Mabo decision said, quite simply, that in 1788, when the first settlers arrived from Britain, all of Australia belonged to its indigenous people, to Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people. And it said that if traditional owners could show their ongoing connection with land, and if that land had not already been given away to settlers, they could claim it and establish an inherent right to land. In other words, a right that goes right back to 1788. That in Australia is called native title. Once people establish a claim to native title or have their native title recognised, they have what's called a right to negotiate. That means that they have the ability to sit down with a company for 6 months and to negotiate with the company about the conditions under which development can happen. Again, if I can give you a concrete example of the change that can bring about, I'll use a proposed liquefied natural gas project in the northwest of Western Australia at a place called James Price Point. This was going to be a huge industrial facility that would take gas from offshore Australia and process it into liquefied natural gas for export to China and Japan and other places. In this case, which is in the same part of Australia as the Argyle diamond mine I discussed a minute ago, Aboriginal people had a right to negotiate. They were able to sit down with the government and with the company involved and talk to them about having a major role in protecting the environment, about being able to make decisions about the environment. In that area, a very important source of water is aquifers. These are essentially underground lakes of water that's been there in many cases for thousands of years. The company was proposing to use water from aquifers for its industrial plant. Aboriginal people were able to negotiate a provision in the agreement which said that if they were concerned about the environmental impact of withdrawing that water, that they could require the company to build a desalination plant and obtain their water in that way. I want to stress that this was not a matter that would later be open to negotiation. It was a decision that Aboriginal people could make themselves to protect their country. And I think that illustrates the significant change that's come about. In this case, because it was such a very large project, this was going to be a massive industrial project that would have a life of at least 40 years. It would have regional impacts because of its scale. For that reason, the regional Aboriginal land organisation, which is called the Kimberley Land Council, put together what they called a traditional owner task force. Traditional owner is the term used in Australia to describe Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who have a deep connection and ownership of land. The Land Council, which is a representative body made up of all the landowning groups in the area, put together a traditional owner task force with representation of each of the coastal groups, because it was recognised that the impacts might affect the whole coast. That group then set about the negotiations with the support of the Kimberley Land Council. But first, it did a great deal of preparation. It collected a lot of information about what an LNG plant, a liquefied natural gas plant, is, what impact it would be, what impact it could have. It invited all of the other parties involved, the state government, environmental groups, the oil company, the civil servants, the bureaucrats who were dealing with this. It invited all of them to meet with it over a period of time It examined them in terms of their plans and their understanding of what the impacts would be. And it was on that basis then that they negotiated an agreement, both with the state government and with the oil company. It was essential to have the state government involved because many of the key decisions about where development could happen, where it could not happen, was the responsibility of the state government, not of a private company. A very important part of that agreement is that while Aboriginal people approved a particular site for that development, they said there could not be any further development of liquefied natural gas along the coast. In other words, that they were prepared to accept that one area would be impacted, but the rest of what's a very long coastline would be protected. That was done by passing a state act, a piece of legislation in both houses of the West Australian Parliament. That means that it's an extremely difficult decision to overturn. You could not be in a situation where after an election a different government came in and simply changed policy in this area. The most important lesson I have learned is that it's essential for Aboriginal people to work together, to work on a regional basis. Like many Indigenous societies, Aboriginal communities or societies in Australia are small. They operate on a small scale. They do not have the capacity, the resources, the access to skills to negotiate with what are some of the biggest companies in the world. I mean, if you are dealing with a Rio Tinto or a BHP Billiton or a Glencore, you are dealing with huge companies that have massive budgets, that have a lot of political influence. If you're a tiny Aboriginal group in a remote part of Australia or Canada or anywhere else, trying to negotiate with them on your own is very difficult. That is why you find in Australia that the strongest agreements are when Aboriginal landowners group together on a regional basis, where they have a representative organisation that can support them in these negotiations. I have started off with a favourable example, with an example where there were strongly positive outcomes for Aboriginal people. I'm not suggesting that there weren't still major issues to manage, as there always are with large-scale developments, but there are many cases where outcomes are not nearly as favourable. And I'll make this comment not just in relation to Australia, but in relation to Canada as well. It applies equally there. There are other cases in Australia in the same industry, in the liquefied natural gas industry, at the same time, under the same legal regime of native title, where traditional owners have ended up with very little by way of benefit from these huge projects. There are agreements where people only receive compensation payments for the first 10 years, yet a project may last for 40 years. So for much of that time, they're not receiving any benefits from projects that have a huge impact. There are agreements where the promises of the companies are vague or very hard to pin down. They promise to do their best to create Aboriginal employment, but if they fail, if they don't do that, because the language of the agreements is so vague, it's very difficult to pin them down. It's very difficult to have any comeback. There are agreements where Aboriginal people have no role at all in environmental management, where that is left up entirely to state government environmental regulation, and if that regulation is deficient, if it's weak, there's nothing that Aboriginal people can do about it. You find, inevitably, that these weaker agreements are in situations where individual groups are negotiating in isolation, where they don't have access to the political strength that comes from unity, from that broader representative base. And because they're isolated and operating on their own, they don't have access to the expertise, to the technical knowledge, to the legal and economic expertise that you need in dealing with these very large multinational companies. There is considerable variance within the mining industry. First, not all companies are mammoth multinationals like Rio Tinto and BHP Billiton. Sometimes you are dealing with much smaller companies. Sometimes you are dealing with companies that only have one project. It's not easy to predict what the effect of that will be. Sometimes smaller companies are more flexible. Sometimes they are less concerned about creating a precedent that will affect all of their other operations around the world. Often with a small company, you are dealing with the key decision makers. That they're not big enough to have specialist community relations sections. So literally, in a favourable situation, you are negotiating with the managing director or with a very senior person in the company. That means that if you can win them around, they have the power to bring the company with them. They are the decision makers. Dealing with big companies, sometimes it's more difficult because they're more bureaucratic. They have established structures. They have guidelines within which they work. They're not as flexible, and they may not be as easy to, particularly if you're asking them to do something that's a bit unconventional. Not necessarily something that's a huge concession on their part, but just doing things differently. Because often Aboriginal people and other Indigenous people want to do things differently. This is one of the key issues that are involved in negotiations. Aboriginal people don't want to be just like other Australians. Innu people or Inuit people in Canada do not just want to be like other Canadians. It's not enough simply to get a fat royalty check. They want to change the way in which things happen. Sometimes it's easier for a small company to change the way things happen than for a big company. It's important to put that issue in the broader context of implementation, because once an agreement is signed, there are many other things that have to happen, not just in the area of managing money. And one of the great weaknesses in agreements, in the early agreements in the 70s and 80s and 90s, was that not nearly enough attention was paid to implementation. In the field of public policy, it's now very well recognised that introducing a policy or introducing a piece of legislation is actually the easy bit. The difficult bit is making it work in practice on the ground. It's exactly the same with agreements. You can have an agreement that's technically very sound, that promises a great deal, but unless you have the follow-up, it's no good. Aboriginal employment is a good example of that. There are many agreements that promise that more Aboriginal people will be employed in mining projects. But if you are going to employ more Aboriginal people, you have to have people who are adequately trained. You have to have a workplace culture that will be receptive to Aboriginal people. If racism is widespread in a workplace, it's very unlikely that Aboriginal people will want to stay there. You have to have incentive structures in place for managers that gives them the motivation to employ and train and promote and retain. There is a big problem in some cases with what is called a revolving door, where a lot of Aboriginal people are recruited into mining projects, but many of them leave quickly. And they usually leave because not enough attention has been paid to making sure that the workplace is a safe and culturally welcoming place for them. The same applies in the area of money. Again, I'm not saying for a minute that it's an easy matter to extract substantial payments from mining companies. It's not. And sometimes there's a huge battle involved in doing that. But there is a bigger battle in making sure that when the money arrives, it's used in a way, number one, that doesn't create division in a community, and number two, that leads to productive outcomes. The first of those, not creating division, is especially important because if you create division, you can actually be worse off than if you didn't get the money. It's not just a matter that the money might be wasted, it actually is destructive. Two examples, actually from the same industry, from projects located within 50 kilometres of each other. They are two uranium mines in Australia's Northern Territory, one called Ranger and the other one called Nabarlek. The outcomes from money in those cases were very different. In the case of the first mine, Ranger, there was a considerable gap between when the agreement was signed and when royalties started to flow. And that was just because of the way the project developed. It just took a number of years. That gave Aboriginal people the opportunity to plan, to think, to put in place structures for managing that money and dealing with it in a way that would be productive before the money arrived. In the second mine, Nabarlek, the money arrived very quickly before there was an opportunity for people to be organised and to have proper structures in place. Suddenly, people found themselves, and remember, Indigenous people around the world, in material terms, are usually poor. When an unexpected and large source of money arrives, people have urgent needs. And in that second case, because there weren't structures in place, initially the money was handed out. It was used in ways that ended up being destructive. People bought vehicles, they drank alcohol, they crashed the vehicles, people were killed. That led to a lot of ill feeling and division in the community. Some people got a great deal of money, the ones who were politically influential, the ones who spoke good English and so could deal with the company and deal with the government and impress the government and company people. They managed to get hold of the money. Other people, often who were people who were more deeply embedded in culture, in traditional way of life, did not know how to operate the system, the white system. As a result, you ended up with some people getting a lot and some people getting very little. That led to a lot of dissent, which continued throughout project life. One of you asked about what you learn from these things. One thing I've learned from looking at the financial side, the money side of agreements, is that if you put a system in place early on that is not productive, it's extremely difficult to change it. It's human nature. Once people get used to having money available, it's very hard to take it away from them. If money is still some way distant, if it's something that's coming in the future, it's much easier for communities to sit down and make good, productive decisions about it. A number of communities have adopted an approach that focuses both on thinking about the future and what's going to happen when mining ends, and on thinking about the present. This is very important because, as I said, Indigenous communities usually are poor in material terms. There are urgent needs. There are needs in education, in health, in infrastructure, in basic services. There are urgent needs in terms of culture, in terms of people being able to be on their traditional lands, to live on their traditional lands. But at the same time, if you allocate all of the money for now, when mining ends, you've got major trouble, you've got major problems, because you have no way of continuing those benefits. And there's a very important issue here about intergenerational fairness, because those mineral resources, once they are exploited, they are gone. They are part of the community's heritage, but if the current generation uses all of the revenue that's coming out, then there is no heritage for the future generations. So a number of groups are trying to have a system where they make very hard-headed financial decisions purely on the basis of managing risk and maximizing financial return. they work with professional investors to take a portion of their money and invest it in long-term capital funds. Now this is similar to what a number of governments and states do, like Norway, with their sovereign investment funds. It's exactly the same principle, except of course if we're talking about a small community, it's operating on a smaller scale. What it does is ensure that when mining stops, you have a capital fund. Usually people reinvest all the income up until that point when mining stops. And then they keep or preserve the capital and just use the income from it. In that way, they have an ongoing source of income. In the meantime, they use the rest of the money for community projects, for providing services. Very important area of investment for Aboriginal communities in Australia is education. So in terms of the present, a lot of people put money into bursaries or scholarships for Aboriginal children to finish high school, to go to university. And of course, that's an intergenerational investment as well, because when those young people grow up and when they have children, we all know that the benefits of education are passed on from generation to generation. It's mixed. There's a mixed picture. Unfortunately, one of the things that happens in the mining industry, we all know that it's a cyclical industry. So prices go up and prices come down, and they go up and come down quite sharply. When prices come down sharply, companies tend to contract. They tend to begin by getting rid of or cutting back on the functions that are not essential, that are not absolutely essential for production. And one of those functions is community relations. So there has been a significant cutback in the amount of resources that companies are putting into community relations. And that's having a big impact. And one area it's having an impact is that area of implementation of agreements, because that has to be an ongoing effort. It's not something that you can just do for 12 months after an agreement is signed. You have to keep on doing it. If companies are cutting back heavily on their investment in community engagement, implementation is something that suffers. The second thing that can happen is that companies start being a lot tougher in their negotiations. I can clearly see in Australia in the last 5 to 10 years since the global financial crisis that many companies are adopting a much tougher attitude in negotiations. And negotiations are ending up in court. That, to me, is very short-sighted. It, in fact, even in the short term, can have serious ill effects because it leads to delays in projects. There is a case in Western Australia I've been involved in where a company was cutting corners, was playing divide and rule tactics with the community, was going behind the back of the negotiating team and trying to pick off individual community members. The community took them to court. In the meantime, the project was held up. The first level of the court found in favour of the company. The community appealed to the next level in the court system. They were successful at the next level. The company appealed. It went to the next level again. The community eventually won. The company had to negotiate, but all of that took 18 months. An 18-month delay in a project can cost a company a huge amount of money. But there's also the longer term. There's what this does in terms of a relationship between a mining company and a community. And the mining company and the community are still going to be there in 5 years' time and in 10 years' time. And if their relationship has started on a really sour note, it's very difficult to recover that relationship. And both of them suffer in the long term. My role is twofold. One is that I still provide a lot of advice on financial aspects of agreements. That's where my specific professional expertise began. And so at the moment I'm working with a number of communities in negotiations, providing them with advice on the financial aspects of agreements, royalties and so on. More broadly, especially as I've gained an experience, I spend a lot of time giving them strategic advice. So giving them overall advice about how to get organized for a negotiation, how to conduct a negotiation. Key to that relationship is being committed for the long term. You cannot establish productive relationships with Indigenous communities except on the basis of trust. And trust takes time. This is not something that you can dip into and dip out of as you want to, as suits you. There has to be a long-term commitment. The other side of the relationship I'd want to stress is how productive this is in terms of my academic work. Because it means that I have real lived experience that I can feed into my teaching. It means that when I talk to students about these matters, I'm talking from a basis of being engaged. Of course, I also talk from an academic perspective in terms of conceptual understanding of these issues. But to me, particularly in this area, because there is not a lot of information available in the public domain, things change very quickly. I think that that's one thing in the last 20 years. The relationship between Indigenous people and developers generally, the mining industry in particular, is very dynamic. And unless you are engaged in a practical sense, it's very easy to get outdated in terms of what's happening at the coal face. One of the pieces of feedback that I regularly get from my students is that they appreciate the ability to relate theory to what's actually happening in the real world. So to me, it's a very symbiotic relationship. It's a relationship, I hope, that works in both ways. It's certainly enormously productive for me as an academic because I get access to this information. And there's no other way I could get it. And hopefully it is symbiotic in that I facilitate the transfer of information to Indigenous communities in a way that helps them.